Thank you for joining our event, Hot Topics Regarding Your Right to Self-Generate Solar. I'm Amanda Pancaw with Prairie Rivers Network. We're one of the many organizations that made tonight's event possible. I'd like to thank all our event co-hosts listed here on the slide, and a special thanks to a few solar businesses that joined, as well as some grassroots solar advocates that helped out tremendously as well. So I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping and introduce tonight's event moderator, and then we'll get started. So you'll notice that all participants are muted. We ask that you put any questions you have in the chat throughout the event. We'll monitor those as we go, and then after all of our presentations, we'll take 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer session with all of our presenters. I also want to let everyone know that tonight's event is being recorded as well as live streamed to Facebook. We will share a recording of the event and a follow-up email, hopefully tomorrow or Thursday morning. So one more thank you before we get started, and that is to Carrie Leiterson. She is our moderator for tonight's event. Carrie is a reporter for Energy News Network, covering the energy transition and environmental justice in the Midwest. She also teaches at the Meadow School of Journalism at Northwestern University, leading the social justice and investigative specializations in the graduate program. So I'm going to hand it to Carrie to begin tonight's program. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for having me here. As a reporter for Energy News Network, I felt really lucky to get to work with and learn from these groups here and all of you working in this field and trying to further the clean energy transition in Illinois. So I'll just give a little bit of very little bit of background and context. So as many of you I'm sure know, in 2016, the Future Energy Jobs Act was passed and really created a solar boom, specifically in distributed smaller solar installations available to residents and nonprofits and small businesses, incentives of making it financially possible for all these different entities to actually get solar of their own. And the program was wildly popular, so much so that the incentives were actually used up more quickly than expected. And that created a whole other problem, a solar cliff, where we needed new legislation that all these same groups, the Illinois Jobs Coalition and other groups, worked together to ultimately pass, which was the Climate Equitable Jobs Act, which passed this last fall. But under CEJA, as popular as the solar program was, really a big swath of Illinois was left out of it. Up to 1 million or so households and businesses, member owners of municipal and electric cooperatives, munis and co-ops, were actually not able to participate in the solar incentive programs. So in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that passed, you all here and people worked really hard to make sure that there was actually a right to self-generate enshrined in that legislation. So that is part of CEJA, but the law doesn't talk about what that actually means, what the protections are, how we make sure that muni and co-op customers get to take advantage of solar incentives. So that's I know a big reason for the panel here tonight is to shed light on this issue and explain the barriers that do exist to muni and co-op owner members and some of the solutions, in some cases straightforward and really common sense solutions that could be implemented if everyone works together to understand these issues and address them. The panelists will talk in a lot of great detail about what these are, just on a very basic level. Some of the problems are unreasonable requirements that munis and co-ops have put on people wanting to get solar, like requirements for $1 million plus personal liability insurance policies or expensive special meters if you want solar, or bans on really common financing arrangements that help make solar affordable. But some of the solutions could actually be pretty simple, maybe not simple, but doable, like standardized policies to avoid arbitrariness and discrimination between different service territories, different munis and co-ops, and mandatory transparency. So you know what your muni or co-op's net metering policies are, what you're getting into, and then just common sense looks at what is actually needed to add a lot more solar solar to transmission lines, avoiding unnecessary requirements for upgrades and figuring out how to do the upgrades that do need to be made to transmission lines. So really, I think almost everyone agrees that this clean energy shift is happening and that distributed solar is a big and important part of it. So it only makes sense that, and it's only fair that people across Illinois get to actually actively be part of that and benefit from it. And ironically, a lot of the same people who so far have been left out of this opportunity are the same ones that are stuck with the Prairie State coal plant debacle, where they're paying exorbitant prices for this mess and unnecessary, really just mess of a coal plant. So that makes it even more, I guess, an even bigger goal that you all should be able to take advantage of solar. So I'll just very briefly introduce the panelists, and I think you can read more about them in the chat. So John Delury is Senior Regional Director with Vote Solar, coordinating state level campaigns for Vote Solar, among other things. And Milena Hessel is Senior Policy Advocate with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And Michelle Knox is the founder and owner of Wind Solar USA, the renewable energy development company. So I will turn it over to you all.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Thanks for kicking us off, and thanks to Amanda for doing so much work to convene and to initiate the process here. I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll just ask for a confirmation that it's working.
Yep, working, John.
Great. So I just wanted to start by expressing just my appreciation that there are over 100 people on this call right now who are hellbent on working on these issues and finding the way to streamline the path towards the decentralized clean energy future. Can you all still see the slides okay?
They're still.
No.
Let's try that again.
We got it now.
Okay. Well, it looks like I might, there we go. You can all see that? All right. So real quick as background into the Vote Solar story, we're a nationwide solar advocacy organization. I live in Chicago and lead our Midwest team. So we have some regional perspective looking at legislative and regulatory campaigns around the country. We do both state level regulatory and legislative work. We also have fun, apparently, according to this photo. And just to dive a little deeper into my personal background, I worked for the federal government on climate and energy policy. I worked overseas for a few years on off-grid solar. But I would say one of the most rewarding chapters in my career was working in Missouri with the Sierra Club, focusing on munis and co-ops. I've always felt drawn to that model, to the belief that community ownership is key, and these entities already exist, being sort of cut from that mold. So this is me in the background of that photo, meeting with some cooperative leaders who were willing to sit down and talk with us about renewable energy policy. And you just don't see that with the larger utilities. So there is hope, there is promise. And while there were some blows in that campaign and plenty of frustrating moments, there is a path forward. I'm convinced of it. So I'm going to run through a fair number of slides in a fairly limited time. So I wanted to just put the bottom line right up front. Cooperatives and munis could and should be leading the way towards this decentralized clean energy future. But this cannot happen without full and fair compensation for solar energy. It'll also require reducing the barriers that customers face. And I'll only touch on a couple of those, but thankfully some of my fellow panelists will be able to dive into greater details later on in the presentation. These utilities, right, these munis and these co-ops can gain tremendously by accurately valuing distributed energy resources and unlocking the potential of the customers themselves to be investing in this clean energy future and committing to this vision alongside the customers rather than in opposition to them. So Before we dig in too deep to the value of solar, to the opportunities that lie ahead, I do want to rewind a little bit and in the course of maybe 2 minutes, tell the story of how we electrified America. So buckle up. So what we saw, and this is a gross oversimplification, but what we saw in this nation's history is initially you had companies, private or investor-owned companies that competed for territory in more population dense areas where you had a lot of customers and didn't need a whole lot of infrastructure to serve them. You just didn't need that many poles and wires. So this created the whole class of investor-owned utilities that serve the majority of the more population dense areas of the country and of the state. As we went along, towns in more rural areas, typically, but not always, wanted electricity too. And so a lot of times they created their own entity, their own municipally owned utility. And these vary. It can be a town of a couple thousand people. It can also be a town like Los Angeles. So you do have municipal utilities at different scales throughout the country. And then lastly, although it's again, not strictly chronological, but really taking off in the 1930s, the federal government heavily incentivized the electrification of everything else, bringing energy and electricity to rural communities, to farmers, taking it that last mile. And thus the rural electric cooperatives were born. And these were supported by the federal government. They helped to get that last mile, and their structure is very different than what we see in other entities and other utilities. So when the dust settled, here's a rough idea of where the customers are and who these entities are. So the bottom line here is that investor-owned utilities are fewer in number. There are about 168 in the country, but they do have the lion's share of customers. So again, they cover the population dense areas. They just serve the bulk of America's energy load. Cooperatives and publicly owned municipal utilities are much more numerous and serve fewer customers. And I primarily raise this, again, just to highlight that these entities are so much more accessible, right? For anybody in this service territory to go and try to chat with a renewable energy expert, they might not get the same access that they would from your local, renewable energy cooperative or your local municipal utility. I'll also flag that we recognize that there are differences here, right? An investor-owned utility that's worth billions of dollars and has a massive war chest and a really robust staff is going to have different capacity and different abilities and different bottom lines than a local municipal utility. So it's not a perfect apples to oranges, but there is a lot to be learned from the different utilities following one another's lead. So zooming into Illinois, we have two major utilities, Commonwealth Edison and Ameren. Together, plus a third utility, Mid-American, they do serve the bulk of Illinois' power. This is also, as Carrie had mentioned, where the majority of statewide policy efforts are directed, is towards these two utilities. Because they are companies and because they are monopolies, they are forced to create this compact where they are regulated. And so the Illinois Commerce Commission is the one ultimately in charge of setting the rates, setting the profits for these regulated monopolies. It also means that there's a lot of pressure that the state and the Illinois Commerce Commission can apply to these two entities to ensure that they are, for example, paving the way for our clean energy goals. So here's the muni story. These two maps show the municipal utilities in the state. You can see that there are a lot of them. And similar to the co-ops, which I'll show in a second, they tend to work together in association to procure power and to set policies and decisions. But ultimately, the quickest way into that conversation is by talking to your local city council member or talking to the leadership at your municipal utility. Likewise, for rural electric cooperatives, you have distribution cooperatives, which are in charge of actually getting the power to your meter, to your home, to your business. And then you have these sort of aggregates of generation and transmission cooperatives. So typically these, buy or produce the power, and then these distribution cooperatives deliver it. And these distribution cooperatives, they're the ones that are going to have that annual meeting with the delicious food and the lovely music. They're the ones that are going to have the faces and names that you can most quickly identify with. And they would have the board of directors that you, as a member owner, could consider running for and try to nudge them in the right direction. Last note on the utility story is that we have aligned incentives in the muni and the co-op world in all the ways that the investor-owned utilities have to serve their ratepayers and their shareholders. Municipal utilities and cooperatives are really designed, structured to serve their customers. And it doesn't always appear that way. It doesn't always unfold that way. And that's why it's in part our role to help nudge them in that direction. And then a last note, there are people all across the country who are trying to turn their investor-owned utility into a municipal utility or into an energy cooperative. This is a big movement in the pursuit of energy justice, but you all have that already. This is already in existence, and I would encourage you to take full advantage of it. Okay, I know we're moving fast, but we'll probably even have to move faster here. The traditional grid is sort of hub and spoke, right? You have these centralized generating stations that then move power over large transmission lines. So heavy duty industrial energy wires and poles that bring the power towards a substation where it gets changed and is now able to enter your home or enter your business. And so that was the model, right? You had coal plants, you had some nuclear plants, they created the power, and then you had to get it to all the different customers right when they needed it, and to balance that in that way. Obviously, there's a lot of losses along the way. The power gets lost along the transmission system, it gets lost in these step downs and step ups. So it isn't the most efficient system. It might not be the one that we design if we were to close our eyes and imagine what the energy future would look like. This might be what we would design if we were to close our eyes and allow ourselves to dream a little bit. This is obviously a simplification, but what we're starting to see is this vibrant ecosystem of energy producers and consumers all existing within the same power grid. And the dynamic forces and data and tracking that is needed to make this vision a reality exist, but they rely on the right policies and incentives. So again, I mentioned I would really just focus in on compensation for solar because it is a topic that can get incredibly wonky incredibly quickly. And I want to try to demystify this a little bit before we dive into the weeds. So with that in mind, if there are municipal or co-op engineers on the call, please come have a chat with me at another time and place. And I would love to dive deeper and to make that broader case. This is for the rest of us. So in the quickest possible sense, this is how net metering works, right? The sun's abundant energy hits your panels. It creates the electricity there. The inverter on your system helps to convert that power so that it can be used in your home. When there is excess power, which I'll get to in just a second in further detail. So say it is the middle of the day, it's sunny outside, but it's not that hot. You don't need the air conditioning. So you're not using that much power. That excess energy goes back into the grid and fuels your neighbors. It goes back into the distribution system. And so essentially what these customers are doing is paying for a rooftop power plant, right? They're putting their money or their investment into this power generator that is helping to support the distribution grid in addition to their own consumption. And so the best way to envision this is, I think, through this chart. I hope it's not too complicated, but the red bar here is the power that this home, this hypothetical home, is using. So they use some energy overnight, right? Doesn't go completely down to zero, but it ramps up over the course of the day, might ramp up when they get back from work and they're turning on the AC to cool their home down again. and then it slowly goes down again at night. This green is their solar energy production. So you'll see that the solar panels do offset a good chunk of the energy load. This whole section here, I'm hoping you can see my cursor, is offset by that rooftop system. But because their system is so productive that day, they are producing more power than they can consume in that home. So they're putting power back into the grid, and that creates outflow, which is a term you'll hear get thrown around a lot. This bump here, this outflow, is where a lot of the battles are waged and the conversations are had. What do you do with that excess energy that's going back into the grid? So there's a few different models to figure out how to compensate solar customers. What we see in the investor-owned utilities in Illinois, in Ameren and ComEd, is full retail net metering. So there are different methods for calculating how net metering works. But again, in Ameren and ComEd, you have monthly netting of the credits with a rollover and an annual true up. So essentially, month to month, you can continue to put credits of excess generation into the piggy bank and then trade them in later, like in the winter, when your panels aren't producing as much for energy. So it's almost like getting tokens, right? You produce a ton in April and May, and then you need to cash them in November and December. And that's that one-for-one exchange. That's that full retail net metering. There are other models. Least favorite among them is buy all, sell all. This essentially is saying that a customer can't even really use their generation on site. Instead, they are having to buy all of their power from the electric grid, and they're having to sell all the power they produce back to the grid. We can mostly ignore that and instead focus in on inflow, outflow. So this is that whole question. You're buying from the utility for retail. What is your power worth when you're selling it back to the utility grid? So is it avoided cost? And there's a number of wonky technical terms that are in there that I won't fully unpack. Or is it the value of solar? Is it a holistic and comprehensive vision for what that solar energy is worth, that extra energy you're putting back into the grid? So net metering, I'll do that first and quickly. It's the easiest method, right? For both customers and companies. It's easy to estimate how valuable it'll be. And it is a pretty good approximation. It depends on the utility, but it might be higher or it might be lower than retail rates, the actual value of solar. So net metering isn't always designed to be a permanent solution, and we tend to advocate for the transition once you have a really high percentage of renewable energy to something else, like the value of solar. I'm going to skip through this case study to be mindful of time here, but this does show this recent snowstorm and frankly how it affected my system. So there are times when the sun doesn't shine. We don't have our heads in the sand on that. And that's why it helps to have this net metering sort of piggy bank to support customers throughout the year. Once the snow melted on Monday, obviously the system kicked in again, and you can see that there is some outflow. These blue bars below the line are going back to the grid and earning me additional tokens for future use. Similarly here, I mostly just wanted to demonstrate what is happening in the investor-owned utilities so that we have a frame of reference and contrast. So despite using more energy this month than I produced, right, 456 versus 102, my bill was quite low because I had an excess of credits from full retail net metering. But here's the value of solar. This is what we'd like to see with that outflow methodology. This is where a lot of utilities, I believe, are heading towards and where we'd like to end up. The value stack of renewable energy is tremendous. If you think about what is avoided when a customer goes solar, it includes the grid services, like the capacity. I mean, these are all technical terms again, but it's not just the energy that system produces. It's also all of these avoided costs that the utility would have to make to upgrade the poles and the wires and the system there. It abates financial risk, right? It can hedge against fuel prices. There's elements of reliability and resilience, and all of these things often get ignored. in a lot of senses, especially by munis and co-ops, when they're figuring out what these resources are worth to the system. So this type of conversation happens throughout the country, but not often enough in muni and co-op territory. And here's that value stack made real. This is in Minnesota, where they do have a value of solar calculation. You run the numbers, you figure out what all the different benefits are, and you assign a number to them. And that's how you can appropriately value that excess energy, that outflow. A couple final notes. Policy instability is a death knell to solar. To pull the rug out from the companies and the customers is a misstep that can shake the market for years to come. So a smooth transition from one model to the next, ensuring that that stability is there, is mission critical. And there are tremendous consequences and opportunities for doing this right, for appropriately valuing renewable resources and for incentivizing them, frankly. There's a lot of talk about the death spiral. Customers might go off grid completely by investing in solar and storage. And that would be a shame, because it transforms what is an asset to these utilities into a risk or into a threat. A lot of money gets left on the table. I know some of my other panelists will talk about the power purchase agreements, but customers in munis and co-ops, many of the folks on this call, have access to state incentives. They have access to renewable energy credits. They could participate in the Illinois Solar for All program, but they can't because they don't have full retail net metering and because they're not allowed power purchase agreements, which is where a third party would own the system. They're obviously losing jobs and businesses and dealing with expensive rates and dirtier power because they're going to be the last ones to decarbonize at the rate they're going. There is hope. Minnesota, this is hot off the press, this is from a month ago, is keeping their rates flat because they're investing in solar and storage. And this is something that we'd love to see in Illinois as well, both in larger systems like this, like a large solar and battery system, but also in distributed energy resources and DG. I wanted to flag that there are distribution co-ops that are trying to take back control. They recognize that they've often gotten the short end of the stick from the power purchasers, and they want to bring that back, right? So these are distribution co-ops that say, hey, if I did close my eyes, if I did dream up the renewable energy system that we want as distribution co-ops, it would have a whole lot more DG. It would have a whole lot more rooftop solar and behind the meter home batteries. And this is efforts underway to transform that. With that, I will pull up, apologize for taking a little bit too much time here, and encourage people to reach out by email or get in contact with me through the event coordinators. Would love to dive deeper with you all.
Great, wonderful, concise but thorough description. And now we'll hear from Melina Hessel.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Melina Hessel. I'm with the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and I'm here to talk to you about the right to self-generate that is in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. I'm going to share my screen. So just briefly to start with the Environmental Law and Policy Center, we are a Midwest nonprofit environmental advocacy group. That means a lot of environmental lawyers, although I myself am not a lawyer. I work on public policy in Illinois, on clean energy policy in Illinois, and particularly on renewables. I helped work on CEJA and this section of CEJA when we were negotiating to pass it. And I'll also note that I and others in my organization have a long history of working with co-ops and munis who are leaders in clean energy. And have enabled net metering policies are leading on community solar. And I know there's a lot of will and interest in some corners of the co-op and muni world to be leaders on these topics. First, I'll talk about the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act overall, and then I'll dive into the right to self-generate in particular. So the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is huge, and it covers a lot of different topics. So the 8 topics you see on the screen right now are many, but not all topics in what was a nearly 1,000-page bill. So there is policy to promote clean energy jobs and economic justice. There's policy for renewable energy, inclusive financing, energy efficiency, policies to ramp down our dependence on fossil fuels in the electric sector, to up electric vehicles, to think about how we ramp down from fossil fuels while transitioning to communities that depend on them economically. And there are a number of policies around utility accountability and sort of changing the utility business model for IOUs, for the investor-owned utilities, ComEd, Ameren, Mid-American, up in the northwest corner of our state, that John mentioned. And that brings me to the one point I really wanted to make on this slide is that a number of these pieces of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act are implemented through or related to utilities, which means that some of them touch co-op and muni territory and some of them don't. So renewable energy, for example, our renewable energy programs have always, since we passed CEJA, been available in co-op and muni territory, and there are customers in those territories that take a part in them. We won a court case to make sure co-op and muni customers could have access to them. However, those customers can only have access to them if the co-ops and munis put policies in place to enable their customers to get credit for the energy the solar systems produce. So, that's one piece of this bill that can be different in co-op and muni territory than in IOU territory. Energy efficiency, likewise, a number of our energy efficiency programs, in fact, I think almost all the energy efficiency programs that are implemented through statute are programs at with the IOUs. Electric vehicles, likewise, some of the incentives for that are IOU incentives. So there is a difference when we talk about the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act about what corners of the state are able to access some aspects of the different programs. Just wanted to call that out in this context tonight. And then that brings me to the one page, maybe 2 pages of this bill that are the customer self-generation of electricity, the right to self-generate that we're here to talk about tonight. And while this is a 1,000-page bill, this is just literally a single page. I don't know if anyone can actually see my video, but it's a pretty short and I think easy to digest section of the law. And I'm going to try to walk it through with you guys right now. And if anyone wants to go through to look at it themselves, I've included a link to this section of statute. So this is a new section of the Public Utilities Act in Illinois. And I think the first thing I want to call out about or highlight about what is in this statute is that this section of statute is that it makes very clear that munis and co-ops are their own independent bodies and will continue to be governed by their respective governing bodies. munis and co-ops are different than IOUs, and they're able to do different things, and they operate in different ways for different reasons. And the law affirms this, but it also talks about the rights that customers have to benefit from renewable energy, from solar systems, from storage. So in addition to affirming the independence of co-ops and munis, the rest of this section talks about the rights of co-op and muni customers as it relates to renewable energy and storage. And what it does is say that muni and co-op customers have the right to install these technologies, to generate energy from them, to consume the energy from them, to store the energy from them, all in the name of offsetting their own load. So this isn't about, you know, a behind the meter customer becoming sort of their own generator and pushing a ton of power out to the grid, but it is about those customers being able to use these modern clean energy technologies that have come way down in cost, and we know customers and the IOUs are benefiting from, to deal with their own electricity use. So specifically, the law talks about ensuring customers can generate, use, and store energy, can deliver energy back to the grid. John talked about, you know, a customer uses energy at the same time their system produces some of the time, and other times may put energy back on the grid and pull energy from the grid at a later time. Interconnect their systems to the grid. Customers must be allowed to interconnect their systems in the grid in a timely manner and in accordance with transparent requirements. And finally, customers must receive fair credit for the energy their systems put back onto the grid. Again, I mentioned sort of the idea of muni and co-op independence. This section of statute emphasizes that the way that munis and co-ops credit customers for the energy they put back on the grid does not have to look exactly like how the IOUs do it. However, customers must be credited, and that crediting must be fair. When statute gives munis and co-ops 180 days from bill passage to implement policies to allow customers to do all these things. And they also ask that munis and co-ops post these policies in public-facing areas of their website. You know, it's hard to use these policies if you don't know what they are. So posting them is important. And that means that co-ops and munis across the state should be thinking about this now if they don't already have policies, and be posting those policies in a little over a month. The deadline is March 14th, as I have on my slide. Additionally, statute provides sort of further language to, I'd say, protect and strengthen the rights of customers to self-generate electricity. This includes protection against discriminatory treatment of clean energy customers, clean distributed energy customers. This could be something like a fee that is leveled only on solar customers, for example. In my opinion, that would likely be discriminatory treatment, as well as giving customers the right to appeal decisions of co-op and munis with regard to accessing clean energy, installing, generating, consuming, all the rights that are afforded under this law, should they feel their rights have been violated. And so that's it. I think I've hopefully stuck to my time and explained this in as concisely as possible. If you have questions for me, that is my contact information, and I'll of course be around for the Q&A as well.
Great, and now we'll have some testimonials, starting with Stephen Nichols.
There we go. Hi, I'm Stephen Nichols, and I live near the Garden of the Gods and next to Shawnee National Forest in Southern Illinois. I'm a leader with a grassroots advocacy group, Illinois People's Action. IPA and I have been working for years to promote renewable energy in Illinois. CEJA is meant to encourage renewable energy generation, and co-op policy as its current it discourages distributed generation. I went solar in 2019 when I have a 10 kilowatt AC array on my property. When I went solar, Southeast Illinois Electric Co-op told me I had to buy a liability insurance policy. SEIEC did not make clear that all I needed was a standard $1 million liability policy. They talked about the possibility of injuring a lineman via feedback through the power lines. My insurance agent had never heard such a policy. So due to the unique description of policy need, I had to pay $368 for my liability policy that year. It's an outrageous sum for a standard liability policy. This year's $1 million liability rider on my homeowner's policy cost me $20. All equipment produced today includes rapid shutdown, which means that the inverter has to drop to less than 1 volt of output within 10 seconds of losing grid signal and stay down for 5 minutes after grid signal is returned. Any liability insurance requirements should be applied to the installers or manufacturers, not the home or business owner. There's no way that I could be negligent since I purchased equipment that meets the safety standards as listed in my interconnection agreement, and I hired licensed insured contractors to install my equipment. It's my hope that the insurance requirements will change as munis and co-ops update their policies to become compliant with the language and the right to self-generate included in CEJA that addresses excessive compliance requirements. My co-op currently pays me for energy sent to the grid as a wholesale power provider. I'm a small solar array owner whose excess generation gets distributed no more than a few miles to help feed my neighbors' electrical loads. The power I generate is pollution-free. It lessens the need for peaker plants by generating the most power during the sunniest days of the summer. I'd like to leave you with this. With a combined tax savings and renewable energy credits, the net cost of my $37,000 system was about $9,500. With annual net metering reconciliation, it would take me about 4 years to pay off my investment. It would take more than 12 years for me to recover my investment if I'm only credited using real-time reconciliation. In fact, I'm only paid 3 cents for all the excess generation being fed back to the grid. I'm not a wholesale energy provider. Treating me as such is punishing me for doing the right thing for people and planet. I'm asking you to intervene on my behalf and the behalf of others in my situation. And I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Jean Corte.
Hi, thanks, Carrie. I live in Highland, Illinois, which has a municipal utility and is part of the Illinois Municipal Electric Association, the IMEA. Many munis and co-op residents, like myself, have been working locally and statewide to ensure that the benefits of clean energy reach all Illinoisans, even those of us in munis and co-ops. Solar programs for school districts are a win for our kids. Energy consumption is the second highest operating expense for schools, second only to salaries. Reducing utility expenses for schools gives them more money for other programs. School districts are perfect solar customers. They use the most energy during the day. It seems like a no-brainer, right? Our neighboring school district, Triad in Troy, Illinois, has had great savings with their solar program and electric buses. School districts all over Illinois, like mine, have been told by their cities that they cannot sign power purchase agreements to go solar. Our cities are in a tough spot because of their long-term contracts to coal. But renewable energy is the future, and our cities need to be planning for that future and finding ways to include everyone. We need to find a path away from coal and a just transition for people and communities affected by coal closure for sure. I hope that munis and co-ops will adopt new policies that reflect the true value of solar and make it accessible to all customers, including schools. Back to you, Carrie.
Great, and now we'll hear from Kay House.
Thank you, Carrie. Good evening, everyone, and I am so glad you're here. I'm going to tell a church story. My church, Evangelical United Church of Christ in Highland, Illinois, we strive to be good stewards of the monies that people give to us. We also strive to be good stewards of the good earth that God has given us. If we could create all of our own energy through solar, we could accomplish both of these missions. Our property board has improved the efficiency of our campus, but we have a very active daycare and preschool and other active daytime activities that really boost our energy use. So our electric cost is a major one. In 2019, we went to the city of Highland, who provides our electricity, and asked for a permit for a solar system. Now they offered, I think, a 20 kilowatt system, but that wasn't going to be really practical. So what we asked for was be allowed to have a system that could produce up to 50% of our annual usage of electricity. And they said, after some negotiations, yes, okay, you can do that. But we had another hurdle that we really had difficulty overcoming, and that was that we needed to use a ground-mounted system. And the city has an ordinance that doesn't allow that. During the exchange, though, we learned that there were other barriers as well. There would be fees for going solar. And in some cases, not in ours, but in some cases that might be a little prohibitive. As Jean mentioned, we are not for profit, so we could not enter into a power purchase agreement, which made, and so that means that we couldn't utilize tax credits, and that made the system and the project less economical and feasible. Because of these barriers, today, EVUCC in Highland does not have any solar at all. We do not save the thousands of dollars and the huge carbon footprint and reduce the huge carbon footprint that we wanted to. Our sister churches in Carbondale and Columbia are doing it, and other churches in our district are thinking about doing it. In a nutshell, depending upon where you purchase your electricity, one church may be allowed to install solar, while another church in Southern Illinois cannot install solar. It cannot have that same privilege. On a personal note, I'm concerned that much of Highland's electricity comes through IMEA, and they buy a good percentage of their electricity from the dirtiest coal plant in Illinois, namely Prairie State Coal. These ties to coal limit our cities, and they limit the amount that our cities will allow to go solar in our businesses, our schools, our churches, and even on their own buildings. I mean, it's just a real limitation to be tied to coal anymore. As Jean said, we have to move to a cleaner and cheaper source of energy, solar. I hope that CEJA will help us do this. I thank you for your time. Thanks for coming. Carrie, back to you.
Great, and now we'll hear from Michelle Knox.
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Knox. I'm the owner and founder of Wind Solar USA, and behind me is our solar array atop our office downtown Springfield. We have the old state capitol and the video capitol. And thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to end this evening by talking about hot topics regarding your right to self-generate solar energy. We heard from Milena about the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act and the right to self-generate. I have identified 11 barriers that we, as a group, have identified that I'm going to speak through. Soon in the chat, you will see a link to this PDF document that will allow you to have that as a leave behind, a reference, and it's basically going to cover everything that I'm going to talk about. So let's get started and move on to hot topic number 1. Okay, the right to self-generate language in CEJA is the first time that legislative direction has been afforded to all Illinoisans in terms of solar. There are 25 separate rural electric cooperatives in the state of Illinois, each with their own independent boards and policies. There are 42 municipal utilities that are members of the Illinois Municipal Electric Association and/or the Illinois Municipal Utilities Association. This means that there are 67 different policies to read, interpret, and correctly model when helping Illinoisans take a look at solar for their home or business. We need a standardized policy across the state to help eliminate discrimination, allow fair access to Illinois solar incentives and rate design, and protect consumers from the unintentional risk of buying a solar system based on an incorrect net meter or interconnection policy interpretation. So for this, our ask under hot topic 1 would be standardized policies in municipal and rural energy cooperative territories. All right, moving on to hot topic 2. Transparency, oversight, and public-facing policies. CEJA requires that cooperative and municipal electric utilities to list their net metering and interconnection policies on their websites by March 14th of 2022. To address a cooperative board, it is often the case that a owner member must make a request to attend a board meeting. It's not unreasonable. In many cases, though, that's 45 days prior to the meeting they wish to attend, and then be granted permission before being allowed to do so. If they wish to bring a guest, they have to list that guest and their purpose for attending. Some boards then limit the time that each owner member has to address the board. After all of this effort, they can do little more than hope to have their issue resolved in the short time they are given to address the board. In terms of municipal utilities, again, it is up to the individual municipality, but at minimum, a request has to be submitted to be on the agenda for the council meeting, and generally a set time is given to speak. In light of a recent public utility corruption scandal, CEJA included compliance and transparency language directed at investor-owned utilities, aka ComEd. Should this not apply to municipal and cooperative utilities as well? Doesn't every Illinoisan have a right to transparent and accessible policies and due process? As an example, Southeastern Illinois Electric Cooperative has a hand-picked committee selected by their administration, which determines who is allowed to run for the co-op board. They control the choices owner members have in terms of who they can elect. The process of democratically elected boards and councils does not apply in this case. Protections need to be in place to preserve these rights. Illinoisans deserve fair and equitable solar policies regardless of where they live or which entity provides their electrical service. So our ask on this would be transparent policies, fair board elections, easy access to board and council meetings to address concerns with elected officials. Moving on to hot topic number 3, penetration percentages. So the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was the predecessor to CEJA, aka FEJA, stated that once an IOU reaches a 3% solar penetration against their previous year's peak load, a value of solar study was to be conducted by the Illinois Commerce Commission with sufficient stakeholder input processes. The resulting regional value of solar would then be applied in an alternative approach to net metering once net metered system penetration percentage reached 5%. CEJA simplified this language, stating that full retail net metering in IOU service territories will continue until January 1st of 2025. Cooperative and municipal utility policies vary widely. Some end net metering altogether when they reach a 1% penetration percentage. Some allow full retail net metering up to 5%. Most land somewhere in the middle. The transitional policy, once the arbitrary net metering threshold is reached, is variable and in some cases unfair. Here are examples. In Tri-County Electric Cooperative, once they reached a 1% penetration, that caused a change of policy from monthly reconciliation to a real-time reconciliation. I'm going to cover reconciliations next to clarify. In Clay Electric Cooperative, a 2% penetration caused a change of policy from monthly reconciliation to real-time or net billing. And in Wayne-White Electric Cooperative, a 1% penetration caused a change of policy from an annual reconciliation to real-time net billing. They just skipped monthly, which is the middle section altogether. Distributed generation allows owner, members, and residents within the municipal and cooperative territories to feed their loads first and then share their excess generation with their neighbors. The credit that is received for this excess production is relative to the way the utility reconciles with their owner, members, and residents, and previously has not considered the value that distributed solar generation brings to the grid. I have been working with the Illinois Municipal Utility Association and the Association of Illinois Electric Cooperatives, Stacy Wilson and Nick Wright. We've had 3 meetings together cooperatively and collaboratively. And they have developed positions on this that are referenced in the attached document. The IMUA has developed a solar calculator in which they're working on determining the fare of solar credit. Presently, they're evaluating that to be 5.5 to 6.5 cents. It will be evaluated annually and updated annually. Our ask, however, there we go. Our ask, however, is that the solar penetration percentage based on a municipal or rural electric utility's total peak load that triggers a change in metering policy for solar should be based on the utility's gap between what they are contractually obligated to buy in their long-term contracts with their power provider and what their actual load is. That gap could be filled with distributed generation from within each municipal or rural electric utility's territory by letting neighbors share their excess generation with their neighbors versus the power being imported from a distance away via purchase on the open market. Moving on to hot topic number 4. Access to solar. Some cooperatives and municipal utilities have limited their owner, members, and residents' ability to go solar, citing that there are too many other customers on the same transmission lines that have solar, or they say we have reached our net metering penetration percentage as discussed previously. When the utility evaluates whether a transformer can accommodate multiple solar owners on the same transmission line, they assume that all the production, that the solar owner will put all of the production back onto the grid that they produce versus using some of the production behind the meter. This will never happen, but it must be taken into account during grid planning. Self-generation works by feeding the load that is behind the meter first and only feeds excess generation back to the grid. Infrastructure upgrades necessary to accommodate distributed generation of solar should not be at the expense of the solar owner, but rather the responsibility of the utility. Utilities, whether they are investor-owned, cooperatively owned, or municipally owned, are responsible for grid planning and upgrading. The IMUA and Association of Illinois Electric Cooperatives have both been provided with information on a pilot program grant opportunity provided by USDA's rural development that would help to fund planning studies that would assist with this responsibility, because it can be very expensive. So hopefully some of the munis or co-ops will be able to take advantage of that pilot program. Both organizations acknowledge that access to solar cannot be denied. So we're in agreement on this one, and that's been updated. Our ask would be that municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives complete grid planning and appropriate infrastructure upgrades to accommodate more renewable generation within their territories to ensure fair access to solar without imposing upgrade costs to their individual owner members or residents. Hot topic number 5. Stephen, in his testimonial, covered this in terms of insurance requirements. He himself has experienced it. Some munis and co-op and most cooperatives require, at minimum, $1 million of personal liability coverage. Menard Electric Cooperative is an exception. They require $2 million, down from their original requirement of $3 million. In addition, there have been ongoing discussions about requiring a utility to be listed as an additional insured on the members or residents' home or business insurance policy. Insurance companies in most cases will not do that. To put this in context, requiring the home or business owner to carry liability insurance to protect against negligent acts related to the purchase and installation of a solar system is not applicable. All equipment produced today includes rapid shutdown, which means that that inverter has to drop to less than 1 volt of output within 10 seconds of losing the grid signal and stay down for a minimum of 5 minutes after the grid signal is returned. Any liability insurance requirements should be applied to the developer, the installer, the manufacturer, not the home or business owner. Home and business owners are not negligent when they purchase equipment that meets the safety standard as listed in their interconnection agreement and hire licensed insured contractors to install their equipment. Additionally, the cooperative or muni has no insurable interest in the home of their member. They are simply a utility provider. So asking to be listed as an additional insured with no insurable interest, which is usually signified by ownership in a home or business, is not allowable by most insurance providers. The investor-owned utilities, Ameren, ComEd, and Mid-American, require a copy of the home or business owner's insurance policy, but they have no set liability limit requirement. So our ask would be that municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives request a copy of a home or business owner's insurance policy with no minimum limit with their interconnection application, and require a certificate of insurance from the contractor or contractors that will be completing the installation, verifying that they have $1 million of commercial general liability insurance coverage. Moving on to hot topic number 6. Net metering reconciliation period. It can be annual, which means that the power that's produced is able to be banked over the course of a year and then reconciled once a year. Monthly, which means that the power can be net metered throughout the month and then reconciled at the end of the month, or real-time reconciliation, which is also referred to as net billing. So the IOUs reconcile net metering credits annually. Municipal utilities vary widely in how they reconcile such credits. Wind Solar USA worked with Springfield, Riverton, and Chatham city council members to create a fair net metering policy. However, other municipal utility policies may not support fair crediting at present. Some cooperatives reconcile annually and some monthly. However, there is a regressive movement to implement real-time reconciliation, particularly in the Southern Cooperative Territories. This means that power fed back to the grid is not banked at all. It is credited at the time it is fed back at market price against the next month's energy charges. So the consumer pays around 12 cents per kilowatt hour for all the power they draw from the grid, but they're only credited 3 to 4 cents, which is the avoided wholesale cost for any power fed back to the grid. In other words, the customer is generating electricity that he or she doesn't need during the daytime that the utility is selling for a higher price than they are paying the customer or crediting the customer for it. This is an unfair policy that makes going solar less attractive financially. In the PDF document attached, I've listed some of the cooperatives that are presently doing that, but I wanted to highlight a couple of the good players. The good players with annual reconciliation policies, at least for now, are Menard Electric Cooperative. They have an annual reconciliation, and Corn Belt Energy Corporation, as well as the 3 municipal utilities that I referenced previously. So also in the PDF that's attached, I have included an analysis that shows you for an 8.68 kW residential system. On one side, it gives you the annual reconciliation cost model, and right next to it, it shows you a real time. The summation of that is that the years of cost recovery went from 4.6 years on the annual reconciliation to 14.4 years in the real-time reconciliation. The cash gained over the lifetime of the system went from $46,523 on the plus side on the annual, and then on the real time to $9,293. Solar sales in the territories that have adopted net billing or real-time reconciliation with no value incorporated for solar have decreased significantly due to this barrier. So our ask for this would be to return to full retail net metering for all systems up to and including 25 kW AC through 1/1 of 25. At that time, adopt a real-time / net billing policy that provides compensation for excess generation that adequately captures the value of solar to the local grid per independent studies that are completed in the interim period to determine that rate, and then shared with the residents and the owner members in transparent local stakeholder meetings. All right, moving on to topic number 7, legacy systems. Now, previously this was called grandfathering. The term we like to now use is legacy. So if a solar policy changes after a solar owner has installed their system should be considered a legacy system and allowed to operate indefinitely according to the policies applicable to their system at the time of energization. This is not the case. This is the case in IOU service territory. Municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives do not include legacy provisions in their current interconnection policies. In most situations, if you install the system in 2020, for example, and the policy changes to something less favorable in 2022, you would be subjected to the new policy, which completely changes the investment financials upon which the decision to purchase the solar system was made. When Solar USA worked with Clay Electric Cooperative to get a legacy provision added, but the final outcome only provided for 5 years from when the owner members energized the system. Financial performance are presented based on a minimum 25-year life of the system, which is incongruent with a 5-year net metering policy change or legacy. So our ask on this would be to legacy systems for a minimum of 25 years after the date of interconnection. Tier 1 solar modules typically carry a 25-year warranty, and financial modeling is typically conducted based on a 25-year outlook. Moving on now to hot topic number 8. Both Jean and Kay in their testimonials talked about power purchase agreements. So PPAs and leases allow for a third party to own the system for a period of time and to use the tax advantages that nonprofits aren't able to. With one exception, there are no municipal or co-op utilities in the state that allow leases or power purchase agreements at present. This is detrimental to the development of projects under Illinois' community solar and solar for all programs, the latter of which exists to benefit low-income residents and in general nonprofit organizations, specifically critical service providers like municipalities, schools, churches, hospitals that do not have the ability to monetize the 26% solar federal investment tax credit or accelerated depreciation. This puts Illinoisans that live in these service territories at a disadvantage compared to those living in IOU territories that do allow that third-party ownership opportunity. So how do munis and co-ops prevent PPAs and leases? Their interconnection and net metering policies state that the owner of the system has to be the same as the utility customer for that particular location. As an example, the city of Naperville, which is a municipal utility, offered the following 3 reasons for not offering PPAs and leases. Number 1, protecting Naperville's right to be the exclusive provider of electricity in its service territory. Number 2, controlling rate increases. More customer generation means higher kilowatt hour charges for Naperville from the IMUA. And number 3, preventing a risk to the tax exempt status of IMUA bonds. Our ask then would be to allow third-party ownership structures that allow for the development of community solar, to allow those that don't own a home or have a good solar resource to choose a clean energy option, and make available the opportunity for tax credit depreciation and depreciation to be applied to nonprofit projects via a for-profit partner. Larger system sizes beyond stated sizing limits should be considered for large consumers on an individual basis and working with their local utility. Both the Association of Illinois Electric Cooperatives and the Illinois Municipal Utility Association say they are willing to have ongoing discussions to assist nonprofits in exploring solar opportunities within the muni and co-op territories. Moving on to hot topic number 9. System sizing limits. So many cooperatives in Illinois limit solar system size to 10 kW DC, direct current. This barely meets the needs of an average homeowner, let alone an ag producer or a rural small business. Municipal utility size limits differ by jurisdiction. Again, the policy in Springfield, Chatham, and Riverton is 25 kW, AC or alternating current in Springfield, and DC in Chatham and Riverton. Per CEJA, the IOUs allow behind the meter installations of any size so long as it is serving on-site load with some allowance for reasonable load growth. Any overproduction in IOU territories is zeroed out as of the annual reconciliation date of April 30 or October 30, and it's the customer's choice. DC or direct current versus AC or alternating current. Despite the fact that state legislation as it pertains to renewable energy credits is based on AC system size, many municipal and rural electric cooperatives base their system sizing limits on DC. What is the difference? The DC system size is determined by taking the module wattage and multiplying it times the number of modules being installed. For example, if I had 3,300 watt modules, that would equal a 9 kW DC system. The AC system size is based on the inverter rating. So in the above example, we would use a 7.6 kW AC inverter with a 9 kW DC system to account for losses that occur when we convert from DC, the DC power that the modules produce, to the AC power that we use when we plug into an outlet. This creates discrimination for those living in territories that use DC system sizing to limit solar sizing. We need uniform policy across the state that bases system sizing on AC, the inverter, not DC, the module additive summation. We do have a couple of good players, as I mentioned, CWLP, the muni, Corn Belt Energy Corporation is a co-op, and also Illinois Rural Electric. They base their policies on AC system size. So our recommendation would be that 25 kW AC for net metering in alignment within the small distributed generation category of the Illinois Shines Adjustable Block Program in CEJA that allows solar owners to receive the renewable energy credit incentive in one lump sum for the 15-year contracted period. Hot topic number 10, excessive meter requirements and fees. Engineers for a local cooperative advised that a special meter would need to be installed at a cost of $275. This on top of the $570 already charged as a net meter / interconnect fee to all owner members for what is called a load side tap. Despite the fact that an IBEW electrician and an electrical engineer supplied a one-line diagram that was NEC code compliant, the utility engineers felt it was still a safety concern and required the customer to buy another meter at that additional cost of $275 and required the electrician to install it before the interconnection could be approved. We do installations this way in all jurisdictions due to new code requirements regarding the 120% rule for bus bar rating, and we have no issues or objections. Net meter and interconnect fees, where currently applicable, are required with application submissions and are non-refundable. If for any reason the project is unable to move forward, municipal and cooperative fees, municipal and cooperative fees for the same services range from $0 to $570, with most being somewhere in the middle, $300 to $570. If we use an average of $400, that is 2 times higher than Ameren's current net meter and final inspection interconnection fee, which was recently increased from $50 to $200 for systems that are 25 kW AC and less. So both associations have said that any fees that are assessed should be transparent and justifiable. And so we're in agreement on that. But we would just add that upon request, justification and clarification of fees is provided to the resident or the owner member. Still with me, guys? We're to hot topic number 11. So fixed costs and the kilowatt energy charges and or monthly fees. So all cooperatives, with the exception of Spoon River Cooperative and the majority of the municipal utilities, hide a portion of their fixed cost in the kilowatt hour charge on the energy side of the rates. The total kilowatt hour charge that we all pay is composed of both energy and distribution costs per kilowatt hour. This allocation of fixed costs is what facilitates the argument that non-solar customers are subsidizing solar customers. The truth is that large consumers are subsidizing small consumers. There is a different way to do this, which allows for equitable distribution of fixed costs among all owner members and residents. Following the Spoon River Cooperative model, a cost of services study is done to determine actual fixed cost of the cooperative. That is then divided evenly amongst each account. Included in that cost is the first 800 kilowatt hours of delivery charges for all consumers, which helps smaller consumers save on the overall kilowatt hour charges, thus addressing the concerns of not increasing the overall utility charge for low or fixed income residents. This ultimately reduces the cost per kilowatt hour the ratepayer is being charged for energy, and removes the argument that non-solar customers are subsidizing solar customers because the fixed costs of the utility are adequately captured in the customer charge / facility charge. Different utilities use different terms. One municipal utility is presently charging 0.03 cents per kilowatt hour of production based on a cost of service study that was completed, which amounts to a $25 fee, a month fee on a residential system. It would be significantly more if it were a larger commercial system. Both associations say that no monthly fee should be assessed relative to that last statement that I made, and that the IMUA will be following up with any municipalities that are charging these fees to reinforce this position. Our ask would be that no monthly fees, we are in agreement on that. And as I just stated, sorry. Okay. So for those of you that are interested in taking a deeper dive into some of the topics that we've discussed or that I've shared here with you today, there are some recordings that are available on the Climate Economy's website. And we've listed them here for you. So please feel free to use those. They are included in the PDF document as well, so you don't need to be jotting them down now. And then I wanted to leave you with some action steps. If you are a resident or an owner member, contact your city council or co-op board members to advocate for fairer access to self-generate electricity. Feel free to use this PDF document as a guide. If you're a city council member or a co-op board member, please consider this information when you're updating your policies to be CEJA compliant, and feel free to contact us if you need any additional resources to assist in this process. We've included here a contact that you will be able, it'll be in the PDF, to which anyone can reach out to us, and the appropriate person will be assigned to respond to that. Thank you for your time and in joining us. I'm Michelle. Here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me also with any additional questions that you may have after the fact. Thank you.
Great, that was awesome, Michelle. So one thing that really all the presentations and testimonials drove home, I think, was a point that John made early on, that perhaps in contrast to investor-owned utilities, or more so than investor-owned utilities, for munis and co-ops, the proliferation of distributed solar should really be a win-win situation. And a lot of the barriers are just seemingly misunderstandings or following the status quo that doesn't necessarily need to be that way. So I know there's a ton of questions. I guess we'll jump into those.
Thanks, Carrie. I got the first question here, and I think any panelist that wants to take it is welcome to. Started with an easy one from Formica Mule, who asked, what are Ameren and ComEd renewable percentages compared to munis and cooperatives right now?
I can take that one. As of with CEJA, the passage of CEJA, there are no penetration percentages any longer. That went away. Now retail net metering continues until January 1 of 25. And at that point, it will be assessed. The value of solar will be assessed and implemented. And so with the munis and co-ops, they all have different percentages, but that's the way it is in the investor-owned utilities per the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think Scott's got the next question lined up.
Yeah, this comes from Bob Pashos, and I think, Milena, maybe this would be best for you to answer. Question is, does CEJA go into more detail about what fair credit is?
No is the short answer to that, Scott. I think we've heard a lot today, though, both from John and also from Michelle, about what fair crediting looks like and can look like. And there's certainly examples we can look to in other states, but in the language of the statute, it does not.
Thank you, Milena.
And Carrie, did you want to go ahead with a question?
Yeah, this is kind of building off questions that Joyce and Kevin and probably others put in the chat, and the panelists kind of addressed, but or did address, but maybe to just sum it up even more directly, really who holds the levers of power here? You know, who can take action and how to remove these barriers and help bring to fruition the asks that Michelle detailed. Obviously, board members have a role, regular owner members is their role for legislators, who should be doing what, if there's any quick answer to that.
I can take
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
or John, go ahead.
I'll take a bite at it and then would love to pitch to you too. I'm sure there's a number of us that would have input here. So back in 2014, I and some fellow advocates worked with a city in Missouri and talked to a few city councilors who had heard about solar, were interested in renewable energy, and within a month or so, they committed to 15% renewable energy and created their own RPS for their municipal utility. And that was just from having lunch with a handful of city council members and people who they knew and trusted. And so the barriers to entry to make this change are fairly low. A lot has changed since 2014 in a lot of different directions, but those opportunities are still there. Talk to your city council member, request a meeting with the staff at your municipal utility, run for the board of your rural electric cooperative, run for something, find a school board, find some local office to run for. I'm very pro people on this call running, but don't look past the rural electric cooperative board, because it's going to be the best chance to ask some of these questions and to get in front of fellow board members, fellow leaders, leaders at the generation and transmission cooperatives. So run or find somebody who you would support to run, show up to the annual meeting, show up to the monthly meetings, engage these very local leadership structures in a very personal way, and it will yield dividends in pursuing some of these issues that Michelle just really effectively summed up.
Nothing to add, John. Perfect.
Thank you so much, John. And I like Hannah's comment in the chat, hashtag run for something. All right, I'm going to share a question from Tony Oplet. She asks, in what ways are the long-term contracts with Prairie State preventing people in muni and co-op territory from generating their own solar energy?
I can take that one. So that when I was talking about the gap, so the long-term contracts, require that munis and co-ops continue to get a large percentage of their power from whoever the power provider is. I think that the gap is probably, I've been told from a couple different sources that it's about 15%. And so, when we were talking about that, filling that gap with distributed generation versus open market, and maybe it can't be the full 15%, because we have to be fair. We have to understand that energy use is variable. And so they couldn't say, okay, we're going to go up to 15% because that's generally what it is, because sometimes it might be, 12, or it might be 10, or, so, but something larger than 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 even. And so the contracts are generally 25 to 30 years, and it just depends on where the municipal utility or the rural electric cooperative is in terms of that contract. I think many of them were probably tied to Prairie State Energy Campus. And that was, I think that was built in 2012. So, there is some time on that, but it would vary from co-op to co-op or muni to muni, but that would be a good question to ask your board member or your council member.
Let's see. Well, Nancy LaPlaca, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asked a question similar to that, Michelle. Is there always a gap between existing contracts that a muni has, excuse me, and the total amount of electricity that is consumed? In other words, doesn't the muni co-op already have contracts for 100% of its expected load?
No. Not 100%. There's always a gap. What that gap is probably varies from territory to territory. And again, getting that information from a board member or a council member would be helpful, and then furthering that ask to fill that gap with distributed generation from within the territory, neighbors feeding neighbors.
And just to add to that quickly, in the case of the municipal utilities, this I think helps tell that story a little bit. So I'm just sharing my screen for a second. This is from the 2020 report from the Association of some of the municipal utilities. So you'll see that about 23% are purchases that were made along the way. So some of that is long-term contracts, some of that is in the market. But I also wanted to use this to highlight that 0.2% is coming from member generation. And that's a missed opportunity, right? We could see this slice get significantly larger. This one on coal-based contracts get significantly smaller. There's still plenty of room, even when you subtract out the Prairie State Generating Company. So there is room to make the right decision here.
Yeah, keeping that missed opportunity in mind is probably a great note to end on. Thanks for all the information and questions. And as a journalist, I was really, really impressed with all these great questions. And thanks for having me here. And let me turn it back over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for taking time out of your busy schedule to work with us on this event. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all our amazing panelists. You guys got a lot of love in the chat for how great you are, and I agree. To our participants, thank you for joining. And we will be in touch with a follow-up email sharing the recording of the event, as well as some of the PDFs and other information that were shared in the chat so that you can have it all in one place. And feel free to follow up with us at the emails that we've shared, that your presenters have shared. We'd love to continue this conversation all across Illinois and work together for a clean energy future. So thank you all. Have a good night.